have an address, you done. It's a lot of people out there on the street right now because they don't have an address. They can't get the proper help they need. They need an address to get the help. Just being in the street, they'll give you food stamps and stuff like that. But to actually get the help that you need without an address, you're in trouble.
The Law Center marshals the power of the law to end and prevent homelessness in the United States. That's our role. We're the only national organization that does that exclusively.
The Law Center has a view nationwide that few have because it has put together resources to help understand what's happening.
So we are a very small organization. We're here in Washington, but we work with local partners around the country. That's how we have an impact on the ground in communities all across the United States. What's also key is that we have a strong network of pro bono lawyers who volunteer their services with us and help support our work.
The cases that we bring in courts are naturally insular and focused on a small jurisdiction, one particular issue at a time. Those sorts of cases don't inform and address national issues well unless they are being directed by an institution like the Law Center that has a view as to what's needed.
So a big issue in many parts of the country right now is what we call the criminalization of homelessness. And by that we mean when cities pass laws that make it a crime to do things that homeless people must do in public, like sleep in public, sit down in public, eat in public.
When you look at it across the nation, where city after city after city is passing these types of ordinances, you land at a moment where there's nowhere to go. If you're down on your luck and you have nowhere else to go, you shouldn't be made into a criminal.
We are not arguing for a right to sleep on the street. We agree with cities that people should not be living in public places. Where we disagree is what do you do about that? We think the answer that makes sense, that solves the problem, is housing. So another big issue that we work on is access to education for homeless children.
We didn't have a stable place to live. We had to travel a lot. I've been to 12 different schools in 12 years. There are only about 2 grades that I completed fully. I didn't always get to go to school.
Access to school means not just access to the classroom, but also to meals, to health care, and to other basic resources that children need to grow.
What's so great about the work that this center does is that they are experts in homeless law, and because they have that expertise, they're able to advocate for students like me and homeless people in general who don't have a voice.
People are not homeless by choice. People are homeless because basically they cannot afford a place to live. Many people are vulnerable to homelessness. It could happen virtually to anybody.
If it wasn't for the Law Center, I don't know where I'd be.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. My name is Eric Tars. I'm the legal director at the National Homelessness Law Center, formerly the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, where for more than a decade I've been working to end the criminalization of homelessness and promote housing as a human right. And I'll apologize a bit in advance. I normally would have prepared much more for this presentation, but as you all know, 2020 has been a bit of a dumpster fire of a year, so you'll get the best that I can do under the circumstances. I was asked to talk to you all today about the implications of the Martin versus Boise case, which I hope you all know about and which I'm happy to do because I know that using the law enforcement system to criminally punish homeless people for doing in public what we all do in the privacy of our own homes every day, sleep, eat, sit down, hang out and talk, stay out of the weather, and go to the bathroom, it hurts not only the individuals it directly affects, but it also hurts communities as a whole, because it puts resources towards hiding the symptoms of homelessness rather than solving the homelessness that causes the symptoms. And I know this conversation is incredibly critical today because we face the potential of 30 to 40 million Americans losing their homes in less than a month if the CDC eviction moratorium isn't extended and Congress continues its inexcusable inaction. Now, more than ever, we know that housing is healthcare and both are human rights. Whether you look at it from a moral, policy, public health, fiscal, or legal angle, housing, not handcuffs, is the best way to end homelessness and keep our communities safe and healthy. The good news is that we're turning the tide, and we have a lot to help communities with, including the Martin decision, which I'll come to in due course. But first, let me start off with a thought experiment. Imagine a person forced to sleep on a cold concrete slab, exposed to the elements, sleep deprived, denied adequate food and water, humiliated and degraded, threatened and harassed by law enforcement. Got that picture in your head? I've got a picture in my head too. And when it's these pictures, there's no doubt that it's torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment at least, right? But thanks to our work, when it's this one, it's now recognized as such, not only at the international level, but also at the domestic level. And vitally, thanks to our domestic advocacy in conjunction with this international standard setting, the human rights of homeless persons are now being protected and enforced by our federal agencies and, crucially, by our own courts as well. And this has been the breakthrough that we and the work that we are doing and others are doing from the domestic courts up to the human rights level has changed policies and made an impact on the lives of the most marginalized and vulnerable in our society. But let me come down from the international level to the personal and tell you a story about Amber Jackminski. Amber is experiencing homelessness in beautiful St. Petersburg, Florida, where tourists can sleep on the beach all day, but despite the lack of available shelter beds, they'll arrest you if you try to sleep on the streets at night. The city also has no public toilets available after 11 p.m. But as a human being, sometimes Amber just has to go. She tried not drinking anything after 6 p.m., but that led to a UTI. So one night, as she huddled behind a bush to pee, she was arrested and charged not only for public urination, but indecent exposure, a sex crime. So now Amber not only has the immediate penalties of jail time and fines and fees that she can't pay, but she also has to register as a sex offender for the rest of her life, making it almost impossible for her to find housing. That doesn't help her out of homelessness, and it doesn't help St. Petersburg solve either its homelessness or its public urination problems. Stories like Amber are far too common. And I know the folks at this conference today know just how common, so I won't dwell on this, but suffice it to say that on one cold night in January, our nation counted more than 500,000 people experiencing homelessness, a number which HUD itself acknowledges is a significant undercount. And when I say homeless persons, many people think of a scruffy, mentally ill, possibly addicted adult, and certainly those are some of the most visible in our communities and are a population who need attention. But who I think of, and who I want you and your communities to also think of, is the more than 1.5 million school students and their families who were counted as homeless last year, a number that has gone up every year since counts began and is more than double what it was when it was first counted in 2003. And why are they there? Because our communities have a dearth of deeply affordable housing. HUD lost half of its affordable housing budget in 1980, and it's never gotten it back, and states and localities haven't made up the difference. Instead, what the states and cities do control, zoning and development incentives, have gone to supporting high-end housing development. More than 90% of the new apartments built across the country last year were luxury units, not the low-income units that these communities desperately need. Fully 1/3 of California renters are paying more than 50% of their income on housing each month, putting them just one missed paycheck, one unexpected car repair away from homelessness. A Florida study found that more than half the homeless people surveyed named medical debt as the primary cause of their homelessness. It is a system's fault, not individual fault, that is driving homelessness. Emergency shelter is not a permanent solution to homelessness, though it can be a good harm-reducing step. But it is a pernicious and persistent lie that shelter is adequately available and people are choosing homelessness. Shelters across the country are at or over capacity, even in non-COVID times, and even where a bed may be open, shelter may not be truly available to a given individual based on gender, age, time, religious, or cost restrictions, and may not provide a healthy environment to a given individual. What I'm trying to say here is that people experiencing homelessness aren't deliberately choosing to sleep, live, and need to go to the bathroom in public. They are there because of the lack of other choices, and indeed because of the choices that we have all collectively made not to prioritize adequate affordable housing and healthcare, or even emergency shelter in our communities. People experiencing homelessness learn that while shelters may exist, they are not really accessible to them, so they no more choose to live in an encampment than a person in a wheelchair chooses not to go into a building that only has stairs to the front door. Yes, it might not be inaccessible to most people, but to them, it's not a real choice. And we'll get down to the specifics of the Martin versus Boise decision in a bit, but I just wanted to highlight this language from Martin here because it is so powerful, not just from the legal side, but for changing that false narrative of personal choice. We've all heard this idea that cities offer ample shelter and services, but some people are just service resistant. No, it is the services that are people resistant. And Martin calls this out. If communities put half the energy and resources into improving outreach and services that they put into coming up with new criminalizing ordinances and enforcing them, we could end homelessness and all of its negative impacts tomorrow. Los Angeles, for example, spends $100 million a year on homelessness, but $87 million of that is on law enforcement expenses, while only $13 million goes to services, shelters, and housing. And we know that every dollar spent on housing first saves multiple dollars elsewhere, so just imagine if that were reversed. Within a few years, all of the encampments that LA politicians get complaints about would disappear, and there would be no need for them to spend all this time and money coming up with new bulky item ordinances or no sleeping in your car ordinances. But unfortunately, that's not what happens. Without an ample supply of affordable housing, we've seen this mammoth growth of an unsheltered homelessness and a more than 1,300% growth of reported encampments over the past 10 years. And in that same time, bans on camping, on sleeping, on loitering, and living in vehicles increased by double or triple digit percentages. In a vicious cycle, unsheltered homelessness puts pressure on elected officials to, quote, do something about homelessness, and what they do is pass ordinances to pretend they're solving the problem, even when they're making it worse. So why does this happen? Because when a constituent comes to their elected official and says, there's a homeless camper on my corner and I want them gone, the official has two choices. One is they can do the right thing, the smart thing, the cost-effective thing, and with COVID, the thing that will save the lives not just of homeless people, but of other community members as well. And that's to get people into housing. But even in COVID times, we see incredible resistance to affordable housing or even temporary sheltering in communities. So that elected official knows they're going to get huge blowback, probably face years of zoning battles before anything even gets built, and have to acknowledge all of the costs of developing the affordable housing up front, and quite possibly be voted out of office before the shelter or the housing is even has its ribbon cutting. Or they can choose to pass a quick ordinance saying that it's illegal for that person to sleep on the corner, and they can hide the fiscal impact, as they almost always do in these ordinances where they check the box that says no fiscal impact. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's actually going to cost them 2 to 3 times more to put a person in jail as it would to simply house them. But that's politically much easier to do because they don't have to acknowledge that cost. And so that's what happens time after time. The criminalization approach is based on this false assumption that individuals are choosing to be homeless in a world with ample resources, and they are the ones who need to be held accountable. But as I said, they are not the ones making the choices that really matter, and it's not a choice to need to sleep or shelter yourself from the elements. So it's not people experiencing homelessness who should be held accountable for sleeping in parks, but our elected officials who aren't doing what it takes to reverse the facts that shelters are full every night and that rents have outpaced wage growth for decades. Every time someone proposes one of these ordinances, there should be a cry from the taxpayers. Why are you misspending my tax dollars to house people in jail rather than adequate housing? But this narrative of personal responsibility allows elected officials to circumvent that train of thought. And because homelessness disparately affects people of color, with disabilities, and the LGBTQ community, and these communities are already subject to over-policing, unsheltered homelessness and criminalization of homelessness hurts those who are already marginalized even more. And that disparate problem means that as we call on our elected officials to help solve the problem, we have to look for equitable solutions that will directly address those gaps. Because when we don't, the consequences can be literally life or death. Today, we have to say the name of Kurt Andres Reinhold, which isn't as widely known as George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, but who is yet another Black man killed unnecessarily by police this summer, just because he was out there experiencing homelessness and in crisis. But because people experiencing homelessness live their entire lives exposed to public view and to police scrutiny, and these laws on the books can literally make their very existence in public space a crime, when race and homelessness intersect, it makes Black, Indigenous, and people of color extremely vulnerable to police interaction and potentially police violence. And this is why we have to connect to the movements for racial equity and support them in their movements to decarcerate and defund the police and invest instead in community services. Much as I love our world of housing and homelessness advocates, we can't get to the world we need on our own. But by joining with the powerful movements being led by people with direct experience of poverty, homelessness, and racism, we can change the narrative and change the outcomes. And when I say defund the police, that's not because I'm against the police. Does the picture here look like a safe situation for these officers to be in? No, it puts them more at risk as well. And that's why the DOJ's COPS office dedicated their entire December 2015 newsletter to talking about alternatives to criminalization, so that they can get the police out of that role. And it's why dozens of current and former law enforcement officers have endorsed our Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. And here in Eugene, Oregon, you have one of the best models of alternatives out there. So you've got a lot to be proud of. It's much better to keep people in crisis away from law enforcement altogether, if possible, and that's what the Cahoots model does. But we know that people experiencing homelessness and other marginalized individuals don't have a lot of political clout, and often their voices aren't heard in the political process. So while we at the Law Center try to work as much as we can with communities to develop collective solutions, sometimes we need to leverage the power of the law. Our laws are very imperfect, and bringing lawsuits is not always the easiest or best approach. But in recent years, the courts have been largely on our side. I want to make clear that our goal in litigation is not to protect the right of people to sleep in parks or on sidewalks. That's not a win for me, for you all, or for the people sleeping in places they're not supposed to be. but we need to stop communities from using the criminal justice system to address the visible symptoms of homelessness and instead focus their efforts on getting people into housing, which will then address those symptoms in a much more permanent way and will be a win-win-win for all involved. When people are housed, they don't need to sleep or eat or go to the bathroom outside. Remember this false choice? Our hope is that our litigation can take option B off the table and give the good elected officials the political cover to make the hard but right choice. They can say, I hear that you want that person gone today, but the courts have told us we can't just sweep that person into jail, but work with me and we'll find a better place to house them, and then we can all come out better for it at a lower cost. We can circumvent that step that always gets them hung up and forced into these false choices that they don't want to be making. So now, this brings me to the Martin versus Boise case and what it means for communities. And by the way, this fact sheet is available on our Housing Not Handcuffs website, where you should all go, endorse our campaign, and check out all of our resources. So way back in 2008, a legal attorney from Boise reached out to us saying he had a couple of folks, Janet Bell, Robert Martin, Lawrence Lee Smith, Robert Anderson, Basil Humphrey, and Pamela Hawks, who had been arrested for trying to sleep in Boise, despite the lack of available shelter beds on the nights they were arrested. And I named them because it took their courage to get this case started, which we did only after trying our best to negotiate with the city. The case wound its way through the courts, and until 2018, the Ninth Circuit, which has jurisdiction over the Pacific Coast and some mountain states, ruled in our case, Martin versus Boise, that it is cruel and unusual punishment to penalize people for undertaking life-sustaining activities like sleeping and sheltering themselves in the absence of practically accessible alternatives. That last part is key. It doesn't mean you can't have a law that says no camping in the park, but it does mean that you can't enforce that law until the community develops adequate alternatives. The court didn't say exactly what adequacy means, but it did give some guidelines. Indoor beds, not mats, not tents, accommodating disabilities, religious or other restrictions. And this is all based on a theory that punishing a person for their status, something that they cannot change about themselves, is cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. This leads to a need for an individualized assessment for people on the street. A shelter which forces a veteran with PTSD to sleep in a congregate bunker-like shelter is not an adequate alternative. A shelter that requires people to be in by 6 p.m. and out by 6 a.m. is not adequate for somebody who's working an evening shift. Adequate means adequate for that individual, and if that doesn't exist, the ordinance cannot be enforced against that individual, and if that isn't clear, that entire law can be struck down. The biggest message I want you to go back to your communities with, though, is that they should not be viewing these decisions as limitations on what they can do, but rather as opportunities to mobilize the community to finally do the right things, to stop using these ordinances as a crutch to avoid the hard, but ultimately more effective decisions to create more affordable and supportive housing. If they use the criminal justice system to sweep someone from one street corner but don't give them an alternative, they'll just end up on another and still be their headache. But if they work to get that alternative through the Housing First, permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing programs you all run and know are proven to work, they'll be off the streets permanently. And while this decision is binding in the Ninth Circuit, where you all are, you should also know that Boise appealed the decision, first to an en banc panel of the Ninth Circuit, which declined to overturn it, and then to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case, which means that the Ninth Circuit's decision stands as the law of the land binding in the Ninth Circuit. That's not an official ruling on the merits binding on the full country, but it is persuasive to the other circuits outside of the Ninth that the ruling at least didn't trouble the court enough to intervene. And this has had immediate impacts, because at the time, the Trump administration was developing plans for an executive order that was rumored to include directives to raise homeless encampments and forcibly relocate residents to essentially internment camps. But with the Supreme Court's letting the case stand, the administration realized it couldn't legally do what it wanted to do, and so reversed course publicly, though they kept pursuing similar approaches behind the scenes. And the courts haven't remained still since. In a case right here in Oregon, a district court judge clarified that Martin's ruling applies not just to ordinances with criminal penalties, but also to laws with civil fines, because those fines violate another clause of the Eighth Amendment, the excessive fines clause. He ruled that any fine for the involuntary need to sleep and shelter oneself is too much. And he further clarified that the ruling applies not just to anti-camping ordinances, but to all of the many ordinances which criminalize basic life-sustaining behaviors of people experiencing homelessness. The city has appealed this ruling to the Ninth Circuit, but the decision stands at the moment. Now, since then, we've been living in COVID times, and that has special implications under Martin. We know that people experiencing homelessness are more likely to get more sick under COVID. So right now, the worst thing cities could be doing would be to put people into congregate shelter facilities where COVID could spread quickly, right? This is why the CDC has issued clear guidance that congregate shelter spaces are not safe alternatives for people living unsheltered, and camps should only be cleared if individual housing units like hotel rooms are available. So our understanding is that under Martin, until there's a widely available vaccine, no congregate space is an adequate alternative. This saves not only the lives of people experiencing homelessness, but anyone in the community who might need a hospital bed that would be otherwise filled by an extremely susceptible homeless person who's instead being safely housed in a hotel room. The message to our elected officials needs to be, if you want that ventilator available for your grandmother tomorrow, you need to house people safely in individual units today. And, as you may know, as a result of this, California has started to do just that, using CARES Act funding to rent hotel rooms for tens of thousands of people experiencing homelessness. And here in Oregon and in other places, lawmakers are even going a step further, looking to buy hotels, which will help create safer, healthier environments for people getting off the street through the pandemic and beyond. And assuming that at some point things will return to normal, we can also see other steps that other cities have taken in the wake of Martin. Now, I know I said earlier that the ruling required indoor beds and that tents aren't indoors, but some communities are trying different forms of tiny homes or box tent temporary encampments as interim solutions while they build up more permanent housing and shelter. If you're looking for bright line rules to follow, this might seem wrong, but for a group like mine, if I see a community doing its best and heading in the right direction, that's a community I'm going to help get to that permanent solution, not one that I'm going to sue for doing this harm reduction step while they figure things out. So in terms of concrete guidance for you, we've developed 6 principles and accompanying practices through interviews with government officials, advocates, service providers, and people who actually live in encampments for how to address encampments. Everything I'm going to talk about today is in our Tent City USA report, so please download the report for the details, which also includes case studies and some of the places implementing some of these best practices. The most important of the principles is that as human beings, we all need a safe, accessible, legal place to be, both day and night, and to securely store belongings until permanent housing is found. We emphasize that we do not accept that homeless encampments should become permanent features of American cities, that we can and we must do better by our fellow citizens than to let them live in parks or shanty towns on the peripheries of our cities. So the first commitment has to be to finding permanent solutions. But that said, until those solutions are there, cities should find ways of ensuring that everyone has access to the basic elements they need to survive with dignity. Second, these approaches need to be guided by those directly affected by them. People living in encampments have been improvising their own solutions for decades. Rather than imposing top-down approaches that meet the needs of elected officials or those not living in encampments and forcing people to comply, communities should be looking to the expertise of those living in the encampments and working with them to develop solutions that will work for all, and that all is an inclusive all. Third, we know that encampments can't be permanent, but moving people without a plan only makes things worse and moves the problem elsewhere. Charleston, South Carolina, which has a case study in our report, removed a 100-person encampment without a single arrest and put many of its residents into permanent housing because they engaged the community and made a clear plan in consultation with them. Courts have required minimum 3 days notice and storage of swept property for up to 90 days, but our recommendation is at least a minimum of 30 days notice and more if possible to allow social service workers to develop relationships, understand people's needs and barriers, and match them with appropriate solutions. Clear procedures and ample timelines protect the interests of homeless persons, law enforcement, service providers, and other city residents alike. Fourth, again, we do not want encampments to become permanent, but we recognize that organized homelessness with resources to address sanitation and environmental issues are better for homeless persons and communities than unorganized ones. For cities considering legalizing encampments, like Modesto did, we set forth several considerations for ensuring it's as close to fully adequate housing as possible, including access to sanitation and transportation for those living there, and policies facilitating potential hosts' ability to provide resources. Fifth, again, alternatives to encampments must be real alternatives, allowing people to bring their pets, possessions, and partners to a safe, habitable, affordable, and accessible place, whether it is to temporary shelter or to permanent housing. Recent court settlements in Orange and Sonoma counties have fleshed some of this out, and I'm happy to go into some of those details in the Q&A if needed. And last, while we believe the existence of encampments is a social service issue, not a criminal justice one, law enforcement does have a role to play, but it should be one that supports the needs of all members, housed and unhoused, in the community. Unless you think that these principles are all pie in the sky, I'm happy to share that the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, dealing with the largest unsheltered homeless population in the country, has incorporated these principles into their own official guidance. So I've shared a lot of the best practices here with you, and the good news is that Martin helps reinforce them. But at the same time, we know that millions of people are at risk of eviction and millions more are hurting. And this guy continues to refuse to negotiate an ample relief package with housing assistance. I'm not making this political. Homelessness should be a bipartisan issue, but the Senate Majority Leader knows he holds the power to rent relief in his hands, and there's already blood on those hands for not passing it yet, and I'm not going to back down on holding him personally accountable. People most likely have already died because they lost their housing and got COVID. People are losing their homes already, and that leads to lifelong impacts on credit, wealth, education, and potentially health. And there's a very real chance that it will get much, much worse before it gets better, and we'll see a dramatic growth in unsheltered homelessness. And we know that at the local level, when communities see more people on the streets, there's more of a push to get them out of public view through criminalization. And we know that all of this is having and will continue disparate impacts on communities of color. And as with all forms of institutional racism, all it takes to perpetuate the unequal status quo is for people to do nothing. It takes active anti-racism to change the baseline, and that there's tremendous pro-racist forces pushing back. So there's no doubt that we have to be playing offense and defense at the same time, and we're already exhausted and traumatized from the past few years. But let me end on a hopeful note of why I'm hoping that 2021 will be the year for the human right to housing. In 2020, despite it being #2020, through our human rights advocacy, we got Senator Warren to directly call housing a human right. And we also got Senator Booker, Senator Harris, Senator Sanders, and Secretary Castro even led his platform with it. And now, for the first time since FDR, we have our president-elect, we have our president-elect calling housing a right. And I was just named to a transition team stakeholder group, and they actually told us there we don't even need to sell them on the idea that housing is a human right. It's what they're operating with as a base principle. We've also had Representative Omar and other members of the Progressive Caucus introduce the People's Housing Platform bills and are actively identifying housing as a human right at the federal level. And at the state level, we had a constitutional amendment introduced in California that would make housing an enforceable human right. And at the local level, we had folks like the Moms for Housing and others taking over housing for people experiencing homelessness in direct actions to claim their right to housing. So I do have a lot of hope. And we have a lot of other tools to help us along the way. Back in 2015, we got HUD to modify its funding application to incentivize continuums of care to advocate to stop criminalization, providing organizations that might otherwise be scared to take a public stance against criminalization with political cover. We'll lose funding if we don't speak up. And despite the efforts of the current administration, we've been able to keep this language in subsequent funding applications since. So please use this to tell your currently cash-strapped community that they could be missing out on federal dollars if they continue their counterproductive criminalization approach. So we know criminalization hurts individuals and whole communities, including by robbing resources from the groups in this virtual room who are trying to actually end homelessness. So what can you do about it? One, sign up at housing.handcuffs.org to join the more than 2,000 groups and individuals who have already endorsed our National Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. That'll get you on our listserv, where these folks are sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly of what's happening across the country. Two, you guys are already doing a lot, but we can help you stop more bad laws with the tools and talking points on our website. And three, you can replace those bad laws with good ones. Again, all there at housing.handcuffs.org. Go ahead, take a screenshot of the website and check it out. You can go there, click off right now, and I'll give you a second to make your endorsements. And it's also the giving season, so our development director requires me to invite you to also feel free to support our work in other ways. So last but not least, please be in touch if you have any questions. Follow me or our organization on Twitter so you can keep up with all the legal developments. Check out our website as well for more resources and join our email list. And I'll just end here with a quick story that actually brings me to the last time I was in Oregon. Back a few years ago when we could actually still travel, I was in Portland speaking with a group of advocates, including some people who are currently experiencing homelessness. After the meeting, a man I'll call Brian came up to me with a tattered folder in his hand. And out of that folder, he pulled a copy of one of our human rights reports and a copy of the DOJ filing that we got at an earlier stage in the Martin case that had actually caused Portland to place a moratorium on the enforcement of their anti-camping ordinance when it was filed. He didn't know that I was the attorney responsible for the report and the case, but he just said, I want you to know to let whoever was responsible for this know that this has changed everything for me. When I hear you talking about my human right to housing, it makes me feel human again, and that I'm not begging for charity, I'm demanding my right to housing. And when this case came down and Portland stopped enforcing their ordinance, I got my first good night's sleep in 5 years. Then I told him that I was the attorney responsible for it, and he gave me a giant bear hug, and he was crying and I was crying, and it was gave me all the feels. But this is why I do what I do, and we at the Law Center do what we do. We work the international system, we work the courts, we work Congress, we work local legislatures in order to make sure that folks like Brian and like Robert Martin can feel human, can enjoy a decent night's sleep, and we hope will ultimately enjoy their human right to housing. And now I hope you can all do the same. Thanks, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We do have a few questions here, Eric. The first one is, what cities in the West are doing their best, and which are not doing their best in relation to addressing homelessness? Are there particular states that stand out as well?
It's a really hard question to answer because many communities have an almost multiple personality disorder approach where frequently you'll see the county doing a lot of good things, taking positive steps, implementing housing first policies, advocating against criminalization, and then you'll have the city, because the city officials are the ones getting pressure from people, as I explained before, they'll be at the same time, you've got one set of government trying to combat criminalization, the other set will be proposing new laws. So there's no one place that is doing everything right. Portland, for example, like I said, they are using their CARES Act dollars to potentially buy hotels that will serve permanently as affordable housing and get us out of this congregate shelter model of care that hasn't worked. So that's great. But, they are continuing to sweep encampments despite the pandemic against the CDC guidance. We see San Diego is also currently in the midst of trying to purchase a hotel and create 300 or 400 new units of permanently supportive housing. But we are in litigation against them right now because they are continuing to enforce an oversized vehicle ordinance that criminalizes people living in RVs. In an expensive city like San Diego is often kind of the last resort for people, particularly people with disabilities who, for whatever reason, can't go into a regular shelter environment. And California as a whole, the state, on the one hand, took the great step through Project Room Key, which then turned into Project Home Key, to try to use the CARES Act dollars in order to create to get people immediately off the streets and then to get them into permanent housing. But it was at a scale that was still insufficient, and they still continue, this past year, the voters turned down rent control legislation once again. So it's a real mix. There's no one place doing it all right, and there's no place doing it all wrong. But we on our website, nlchp.org, there's a whole page devoted to coronavirus actions, and there's a tracker there where you can see the responses that communities have taken all across the country. We don't endorse them all because, again, they're likely, even the good things are still insufficient. But it's a good place to go and be able to say, look, this is what another community has tried. Why don't we try this here? So, that's as good as I can get on that question.
Thank you. Our next question is, what's the working definition of alternative space? What is an adequate amount of alternative space whereby you would not oppose sweeps?
Like I said, the alternative has to be accessible to each given individual. And we can set a lot of those things up in advance. You can create more, permanent supportive housing units, individual housing units that'll be accessible for people with various forms of mental disabilities, family units that will allow families, however defined, to stay together. Again, those kind of 4 Ps, pets, partners, possessions, and parking are really important to enable people to, not be forced to break up their family however they define it, and to be able to bring their belongings with them into shelter. So it's, low barrier shelters with lots of different alternatives that actually meet the needs of the individuals who are being impacted. And that's how the the communities within the 100,000 Homes campaign were able to house 100,000 of the supposedly most service-resistant individuals. They sent outreach teams out to talk to them, meet with them repeatedly. It took a little bit longer to get them off the streets, but they figured out what the barriers were to the people getting off the streets. So, Joe is a veteran, and he needs a non-congregate space so his PTSD isn't triggered. But Jane, might just be, she lost her job and was evicted. She doesn't mind sleeping in a congregate space. So when that congregate bed opens up, you give it to Jane and don't try to force Joe into it. And then when the individual room opens up, you give that one to Joe. You need to do these, by name lists. This is all stuff that we know, has been proven to work, evidence-based approach. And the good thing about it is when you take this approach, rather than cycling somebody from the streets into a shelter situation that doesn't actually work for them, and then they go back out to the streets, you're actually creating a permanent, a lasting solution. So that investment of resources pays off in the long run. And as I said, the average shelter situation, even for a year, costs a couple $1,000s, whereas putting somebody into jail for a year can cost tens of thousands of dollars. The average jail, just an overnight in jail, costs about $100 to $120 a week, or a night. And so a week in jail could pay for a month of a person's rent. And so those are the choices that we're making. Again, the choices that we need to bring out and we need to bring into the light to say, this is it's much more efficient for us to put people into housing, into situations that are appropriate for them, that will enable them to, stabilize, get on their feet, and move out of homelessness, rather than putting somebody into a jail cell, incurring more costs for the community, and giving that person a criminal record and fines and fees that are going to be a barrier to them ever getting out of homelessness. So, there is a greater investment to figure out what the adequate solution is for each individual, but ultimately it's the one that's going to be much more effective and more cost effective.
Thank you. Our next question is, how can race equity be implemented in our homeless service system? Whenever our community has tried to prioritize a certain group, fair housing is cited and people quit working on the issue. Data has shown for years that our brown and black communities are underserved and experience homelessness at higher rates. If we can't prioritize or only offer services to a group based on race or ethnicity, then how do we achieve race equity?
Good question. I've one of the best things I've heard recently was on an interview with one of the folks at the CDC who was talking about how they were going to prioritize the distribution of vaccines when we know that Black and brown communities are being hit harder. And so how are they going to prioritize those groups if not by race? And the person there said that they wouldn't be prioritizing by race, but by racism, by the incidence of racism, which are all the kind of economic factors, the fact that they are in low-wage jobs, that they often lack childcare and have to go out, all of those things that make them more vulnerable. So if you look for the social determinants of health, the indicia of racism, you can focus on those things without necessarily needing to explicitly focus on race per se. And I just heard this last week, so I don't know exactly how to implement that at the service provider level, but it sounded really good to me. And I think as you are doing that, we at the policy level, groups need to be speaking out and affirmatively identifying racism as a problem, including emphasizing institutional and structural racism, not just interpersonal racism, and the fact that if we don't call it out, if we don't affirmatively address it, then, as I said before, all it takes for institutional racism to continue is for us to continue doing nothing about it, for not calling it out, and then the status quo allows it to persist. So we need to be actively taking an anti-racist stance in our external policy advocacy, even if we can't, the fair housing type arguments are used. And I think there is actually more wiggle room than people might assume there is there. We're actually doing some legal research right now to see what we can, if we can give better guidance on exactly what people are and aren't allowed to do, more specifically with race itself as a criteria. But I think using racism and its social indicators as kind of your proxy gets you to the same place in a legally acceptable way.
Thank you. This next question comes from our friends at Best Care in Central Oregon. In the post-Martin v. Boise world, have there been any police abuse or pretext arrests of homeless public property campers? For example, campers arrested for disorder conduct or disturbing the peace.
Oh, yes. One of the challenges with the lawsuits that we bring against criminalization ordinances is that every time we bring a case to knock down one ordinance, they pass another slightly differently worded one, or they use other ordinances of more general applicability, like trespass or disorderly conduct, in order to accomplish the same ends. That's always been a challenge. That's why cases like the Grants Pass case are important, because they say it's not just it's not just criminal ordinances, it's also the civil fines and infractions. It's not just the anti-camping itself, but it's also anything that kind of makes it impossible for people to undertake their basic life-sustaining activities. So at the end of the day, you look at the enforcement, not just what's on the books itself, but how is that law being enforced? And that's, unfortunately, it's much more time intensive. It's much more difficult to bring those as applied challenges as opposed to a facial challenge. You need to build up, a very good set of facts. You need to be able to verify that there wasn't, in fact, shelter available on the night in question. So it's not easy, but I think what on the policy side, you keep with the same argument that, like, using our resources in this way is a really poor use of our resources. It's not going to get us to the end that we all want to get to. And I think reframing the conversation around shared goals is the way to get around that. You say, we all want to see a Portland or, wherever it is, without people who need to live on the streets. That's the goal we all share. And if we share that goal, shouldn't we also share the desire to get there using the most effective, most cost-effective means possible? And if you can get people to that point, then you can point them to the evidence that criminalization doesn't work and in fact hurts, and housing does work. But it's often not easy to get to that point. But yeah, I mean, we not only do we see communities using these other alternative laws, like I said, Los Angeles passed a bulky items ordinance, to criminalize not the people themselves, but the fact that they are storing belongings on the sidewalk, as a way of avoiding saying that we're criminalizing them for sleeping. We're just criminalizing them for having a tent around them while they sleep. But we're not criminalizing the camping. We're not, so they find all different ways of doing it, and they're even trying to pass new ordinances that continue to criminalize camping, but carve out exceptions for different time, manner, and place exceptions to it, to try to make it, consistent with what they interpret as Martin's restrictions. And, why they are spending taxpayer dollars to try to thread this legal loophole and create a new ordinance that isn't going to solve homelessness, is, rather than actually investing time and resources into creating solutions that are actually going to work, it's really frustrating.
Thank you. Our next question is, the moratorium is going to end on 12/31/20. Our next president is not inaugurated until 1/20/2021. What do you foresee happening during that lapse? What can we do to mitigate these issues and concerns?
Yeah, this is the problem that keeps me up at night, and makes me want to cry every day, because, like I said, we've seen this problem coming a mile away. We saw it coming back in August when the CARES Act moratorium expired, and rather than, providing the rent relief then that was desperately needed, the Senate Majority Leader punted, and we ended up with the CDC moratorium, which is not as good as rent relief. And now we're going to lose even that already inadequate protection. And it's not clear at all that even the bills that have been introduced by the majority leader haven't addressed the rent problem, and haven't suggested that there's going to be a new institution of a moratorium. So I'm really concerned. I'm hoping that the CDC will act to extend the moratorium, at least through the end of December or through the end of January, so that then the new administration can take action. But it's not clear that that's going to happen. So I think what we can be doing is, calling our elected officials, demanding rent relief now, tweeting #rent relief now. There's a sign-on letter going around right now from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for folks to sign on to address specifically this gap problem and demand more permanent solutions in the long term. So people should sign on to that and go to the Low-Income Housing Coalition's website to learn more about it. And in communities, in the absence of the federal action, you should be also looking to the state, county, or city level to try to create solutions. There's so much possibility here. There are so many, they could create moratoria on evictions at the local level. They could create, rental assistance programs, repurposing some of the CARES Act dollars that may not have been spent yet. And if people are going to be evicted into homelessness, they could be making arrangements with hotels right now. Like, we know that the entire travel industry is desperate. There are no people staying in hotels and motels right now. So, they could even be offering tax breaks or things like that to these places in exchange for letting people stay there if they do become homeless, and give them a place to immediately go to, rather than having to wander the streets, wander around looking for new apartments, spreading COVID the whole time. There are other vacant properties that could be used. Even school buildings right now, they're largely empty in communities that are doing virtual teaching. People could be staying in those rooms. None of that is ideal. The best thing is to get federal relief, get dollars directly into the hands of renters so that they can pay their landlords and avoid eviction, avoid late payments and all of that. But, I think communities should be looking at these creative solutions that they can be implementing in the meantime.
Thank you. We heard in Portland yesterday that 52% of people arrested pre-pandemic are homeless. How much of this problem is created by a hungry criminal justice system, which is far larger than just police?
As I said, I think it's the real culprit is the elected officials who are taking what they see as the easy way out when they're confronted with homelessness, and they don't want to have to make the hard decisions about acknowledging costs up front and actually fighting the zoning battles and everything they need to get the affordable housing situated that we actually need. And so their easy way out is to pass these ordinances and hide all the costs. In that way, they appear to be responsive to their constituents' demands, even though they are making it worse. Because it's a real political incentive problem, and that's why we hope that using litigation we can remove some of those incentives and change the playing field. But once those laws are in place, the law enforcement system is able to, and in some cases encouraged to, enforce them, and then you do get this vicious cycle. People, who are criminalized for being in public spaces, arrested, given tickets that prevent them from getting out of homelessness, so they're actually out there longer, more visible, more separated from resources that could get them out of homelessness, and then there's more call for harsher enforcement of those laws, and we get back to square one. I think there are a lot of law enforcement officers who I said, do endorse the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign because they don't want to be in this role. They don't want to be sent out to deal with a person in crisis that they don't have adequate training for, because they know that's just the next viral video incident waiting to happen. They would rather have trained social workers going out there giving people help, and ideally those social workers backed with actual housing and resources that they could offer people to get them into a better place. But there are certainly other law enforcement leaders who do take a very, those who adhere to the discredited broken windows approach to policing. Certainly plenty of them still out there who are, hungry and looking for more people to lock up to show that they are, harshly enforcing these laws. I don't think that we shouldn't view the law enforcement system as a monolith, just the way we wouldn't view other communities as a monolith, and we should look for those allies within it. There's an organization called Law Enforcement Action Partnership, LEAP. I think it's lawenforcementactionpartnership.org or something like that. They have a network of progressive law enforcement all across the country who are available to give speeches, write op-eds, give testimony that can help bring that message that law enforcement actually is in favor of decriminalization and investing in better community alternatives as law enforcement, as well as other members of the community.
Thank you. I think that's actually our last question for the afternoon. We appreciate your involvement today and sharing with all of us and answering these questions. And we're going to take a little break here before our next session begins. Thank you again, Eric.
Thank you. Have a good night.